Hello and welcome to our 18th podcast. I'm Linda and here is Mike.
Hi, Linda. Welcome, everyone. In this podcast series, we are exploring social threefolding by reading and discussing the original 1919 basic book by Rudolf Steiner, The Core Points of the Social Question. We are currently right in the middle of Chapter 2, which describes the principles and theory of social threefolding. As our need for individual freedom grows, we need a new social paradigm called social threefolding to take our existing hierarchical society a next evolutionary step forward. In a threefold society, the three areas of social life, economics, rights, and culture, will be functionally separate, much like how the nervous system, rhythmic system, and metabolic systems are functionally separate in our physical body. The economic life has everything to do with production, distribution, and consumption of goods. The rights life is everything to do with purely human-to-human relations. And the cultural life is everything to do with individual abilities. The economic life exists between the boundaries formed on the one side by the natural foundation and on the other side by the life of public law, the rights life, which regulates it from outside. Through the economic life, relations arise between people because one person serves the needs of another. This economic relation is entirely different from what arises through the rights life, which has to do with our mutual entitlements and obligations under the banner of equality. And if rights and economy are combined together into a single state structure, each must necessarily corrupt the principle of the other. So instead, rights and economy must be structurally separated. In a threefold society, the rights state will have its own independent legislative and executive bodies, and the economic life will have its own independent associations and money system. The leadership of each area will meet as peers, much like how leaders of sovereign countries do today. Each area will cultivate its own principles and influence the other from the outside. In a healthy society, labor and real estate must be removed from economic markets because these are not economic goods. We must not be allowed to purchase human-to-human rights like we do economic goods. Because labor cannot be separated from the human being who performs it, if we purchase labor like a good, then we commodify the human being. We can, however, purchase what labor produces or achieves, because this achievement is a good, or at least has the character of a good. But we cannot purchase the labor itself. Labor is purely a matter of rights and fairness between people, and so this must be governed by the rights life. And similarly for real estate, which is likewise not a good, and is fundamentally a matter of human-to-human rights. We must make a clear distinction between nature, such as land and soil, which no human being produced, and any buildings and infrastructure, which human beings obviously did produce. Logically, because no human being produced land or nature, no human being has any right to charge another human being money for the right to use this naturally occurring component of real estate. Modifications and buildings, however, were created by human beings, and so this human-made component starts off initially as an economic good because it is produced in the same manner as any other good. However, once the infrastructure development is finished and the agricultural or commercial real estate transitions to a means of production, then at that moment it ceases to be an economic good and instead must pass over to the rights life and the cultural life to own and manage. The rights life administers the right to transfer, and the cultural life directs the right to use to some competent independent manager. This arrangement ensures that means of production are used fruitfully to bring forth economic goods that satisfy human needs within the economic life. In a modern society based on the division of labor, it is acceptable to exchange rights for goods. However, this must always be done in such a way that the right does not, in the process itself, become a good. It is fine to compensate someone for the gain or loss of rights, to compensate someone for providing a help through labor, or for the loss of rights upon transfer of real estate, using goods, or money representing a claim on goods. However, it is not fine to be able to purchase a human-to-human right on a market as if it were a good. The rights life of human-to-human relations and the economic life of goods must be kept entirely separate. And so we must consider the relation between employer and employee as having two tracks. On the rights track, the obligations to work are set out through the democratic rights life. And then the worker, within the limits set out by labor laws, performs labor for the collective at the direction of the employer. Meanwhile, on the economic track, the achievements of the worker's labor are purchased by the employer according to a distribution contract, which describes what share of the collective economic product each contributor receives. And if we widen this perspective out to the whole society, then we can see how every adult person participates in the democratic rights life, which establishes the fair standards of living in conjunction with what the economy can reasonably produce, given the natural conditions on the one hand and the public laws governing the amount and kind of labor on the other. Within the economy, various self-interested blocks, such as cooperatives and corporations, will arise. The economic life, however, will be administered by a bottom-up, layered network of economic associations, which are not any kind of self-interested group. The associations comprise representatives from all aspects of the economic life who come together to observe prices in relation to human needs, and then increase or decrease production to ensure that prices are healthy. So the associations must work within the limits set out by the independent democratic rights state acting from outside. And in this way, the same workers and consumers who are involved in the economic life are also responsible for placing limits on the economic life. And this will then render unnecessary the roles of labor unions, business alliances, and social democracy. At the same time, the rights state stays out of economic and business affairs, despite the fact that the same individuals are often involved in both social areas. So in a threefold society, the areas of social life are separated, not the people. Individual people transcend the separation and bring the independent areas of social life back together to create a coherent unity. This is something quite different than our current unified society, where economy and state remain bound up together, and there is no possible separation of functional principles. Okay, so that's where we're at. Is there anything we need to discuss before we get started?
Nope, we can move on. Thank you for that summary.
Okay.
Complex, but really good. Thanks.
All right, so let's switch over to the screen share and go to the book now.
Mhm.
So we had left off, we were on page 59, and we had read this paragraph about Austria. If you remember, it's a little historical. He was saying that when Austria and Hungary fused into the dual monarchy in 1867, they adopted a constitution which ensured that the aristocracy and the wealthy had disproportionate power over political affairs. This constitution was a feudal leftover that fused economic forces directly into the right state. And this created the circumstances for tremendous divisiveness among the many different national and language groupings within the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And because there was no real democracy and no independent cultural life, tensions arose, eventually leading to the assassination of Archduke Ferdinand by a Bosnian Serb rebel that ignited the flames of World War I. And one wonders what might have been different had the Austro-Hungarian Empire instead taken up a threefold ordering in which the economic powers had their own independent existence, where the rights life was truly democratic, and an independent cultural life allowed for the freedom of language, traditions, and education, would a peaceful coexistence of people perhaps have been possible? So that's what we had talked about last time.
Hmm. Hmm.
So should we go on?
Let's go on. Yes.
So the next paragraph to read is the one that starts the modern person interested. And I'll
Hmm.
just warm this up by saying briefly that the modern person who takes an interest in public life often focuses on issues of secondary importance, Steiner says. Due
Hmm.
to their habits of thinking, these people conceive of society as a unitary structure. They do not realize that such a unified structure is infeasible in a democratic society, simply because no reasonable electoral system can be established. Every electoral system for a body that unifies both rights and economy, where these necessarily interfere with one another, must lead to serious social problems. So it must become the highest of priorities within public life today that we work towards the separation of state and economy. The processes of choosing those responsible for both right, state, and economy will have to occur separately, using separate methods and separate criteria. Therefore, the questions of electoral procedure, such as first past the post, ranked choice voting, proportional representation, electoral college, and so on, all this is really only of secondary importance. The first task must be to separate state and economy through a gradual, respectable process of dissolving the old and reshaping the new. Steiner is not proposing any kind of sudden change from one day to the next, yet historical evolution demands that we take rational and active initiative in the direction of social restructuring. Okay?
Okay.
So I'm going to ask you then to read Steiner's words and then we'll
Hmm.
discuss.
Okay. Sounds good. The modern person interested in public life usually directs their attention to things that are only of secondary importance to this life. They do this because their habit of thinking leads them to conceive of the social organism as a unified structure. But for such a structure, no corresponding electoral procedure can be found, because with every electoral procedure, economic interests and the impulses of the rights life must obstruct each other within the representative body. And for social life, what flows from this obstruction must lead to convulsions in the organism of society. The very first of necessary priorities for public life today needs to be working toward a thorough separation of the economic life and the rights organization. By enacting this separation, the separate organizations will find, out of their own foundations, the best ways to elect their legislators and administrators. Among what is currently pressing for decision, questions about electoral procedures, even though they are of fundamental significance, as such are still only of secondary importance. Where the old conditions still exist, work is to be done based on these conditions toward the indicated separation. Where the old has already dissolved or is in the process of dissolving, individual persons and alliances between people must pursue initiatives towards a reshaping that moves in the indicated direction. To want to bring about a transformation of public life from one day to the next is something even sensible socialists see as fanaticism. Such people expect the healing they contemplate to occur through a gradual, respectable transformation. In any case, the clear facts can teach any unprejudiced person that at the present time, the forces of historical evolution of humanity make a rational desire toward social reorganization necessary.
All right. Thank you, Linda.
Okay.
So, yeah, what's he saying? I think he's talking about how because when the economy and the government are fused, when it comes time to voting, it doesn't really matter what system of voting we have. When they're fused, we're always sort of in this schizophrenic state of, am I going to vote for the person or the group that supports the rights life or the economy, right? Because if they're fused together, you have to amalgamate your voting choice into a single group that that does both of these things.
Hmm.
And in a way, he's saying the very first thing we need to do before we talk about what kind of voting system we should have, we should separate these two. And then when we do have a voting system of whatever kind we want, we're electing just a representative who's interested in legislation and law and rights.
Hmm.
And we're not electing someone who's doing the economy and jobs and all that stuff as well.
Hmm.
These should be
This,
two separate things. Yeah.
yeah, this makes so much sense. I mean, like every time voting comes around, that is literally, I mean, you said it well, in a schizophrenic state. It's like, what do we do?
Yeah.
Because you want the rights of people to be sort of taken seriously and thought about and, you know, held responsibly. But at the same time, you don't want the economic interests to be sort of let go. We need competent people that do have an understanding of economics. Not everyone does.
Right.
Um, so, you don't want to have someone lead from feelings, you know, only.
Yeah.
Yeah, just, you want to make sure that the people that are actually, both of those things are actually taken care of. And so separating them, this makes so much sense to me. Yeah.
And we often find this kind of cycle where we will elect, say, one party in a democracy, and that party might emphasize, let's say, the economy, and let other things go be neglected. And then after a while, we find, oh, these other things are being neglected, so let's go to the opposite extreme, and we'll elect someone else, and then the economy gets neglected. And then we just keep going back and forth between these two cycles. And I think what Steiner is suggesting is by separating the rights life and the economic life, electing the politician is not going to have any significant economic impact because
Hmm.
the economics is handled by someone else.
Hmm.
So if the democracy makes a poor choice in that regard, it's not really going to affect the economy so much. The politician's job is really just about laws.
Hmm.
And so I think it takes some of the weight off the electoral process. That it's not such a, all-in kind of betting system. You can sort of divide up your betting so that you're only voting for the politician that supports the rights life. And then the
Hmm.
economy is handled independently of this.
Hmm. And does Steiner go on to say anything about global politics and global economy, or is that not covered?
Well, he gives lectures that are in a translation, they're called the world economy, but he himself called it national economy,
Hmm.
the national economics course. But he does speak about the world economy in those lectures.
Hmm.
Uh, what I'm want to say is that he has this in mind that
Hmm.
the economy should grow from the grassroots, not through political influence. The economy should grow into a world economy, but not
Hmm.
as a kind of political committee deciding this. He's quite against that.
Hmm.
And the
Okay.
political process is, I mean, there's the rights of citizens, and then we could talk about human rights on another level.
Mhm.
But this should have nothing to do with the economy.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
It makes sense. Yes. Yes, it does. Yeah.
Okay.
I think it's an important point as well because, I think many of us who care, who are voting, are kind of stuck between this sort of, okay, who do we choose this time? Like, but separating this would kind of allow us to sort of actually look at the things that hopefully, I mean, the rights will be the thing that people will be looking at, and somebody who is competent in the rights area, who has best interests of the groups of people that, like he's saying, and I think, the cultural part of it as well,
Yeah.
where languages and stuff will be more um, honored, it seems. Maybe I'm injecting that in there.
Well, what he's saying is that the education system will be separated out of the state so
Hmm.
that when we're voting for politicians, let's say, we're not voting for someone who has anything to do with education, schools, university, medical, senior care, media.
Hmm.
All of
Hmm.
these things are not related to the government. That
Hmm.
he's an advocate of small government, that the government's only job is fairness. And they are kind of like the rhythmic system to balance out the two poles of the economic life on the one side, the life of goods, and the cultural life on the other side, the life of abilities.
Hmm.
So the government is not running anything. They're just sort of balancing out these two groups that are running things.
Mm. I think it would be much less sort of sought after by the characters that seek government today, like if they don't have that kind of power, right?
Right.
So,
That's right.
mhm,
And decentralizing the society into these three parts also decentralizes the power. And this is what the example of Austria showed us, that if you put all the power in one place, then necessarily the cultural life or some other group has no power. And so
mhm,
they will lead to division and problems.
yeah,
So
very,
everyone should have a little bit of power.
mhm,
And not
absolutely.
everyone as in people, because people are all part of all three areas. I'm just saying that the areas of social life, these should be decentralized centers of power.
Hmm.
Be clear, yeah.
Yeah, cool.
Okay, should we move on?
Yes.
So, we had read this, and where are we now? Anyone who, yeah, here.
Anyone who considers, yeah.
That's right. A little paragraph here, and he's just going on to say, uh, people quite often confuse what is practical with what is familiar, and they consider what is unfamiliar to them to be synonymous with the impractical. However, unless people with influence over society can learn to think in a new way, they will only contribute to the further illness of the social organism. They will be no different from similar people in the past who thought their ideas were practical, but who actually brought about the current unhealthy conditions. All right, could you read that,
Yep,
please?
sure. Anyone who considers practically feasible only what they themselves, from a narrow horizon of life, are accustomed to, will consider what is suggested here to be impractical. If they cannot turn over a new leaf, and if they retain influence over some area of life, then they will not work toward the health, but rather toward the further illness of the social organism, just as similar people have worked to bring about the current conditions. Mhm.
Yeah. So, people in the past and even today, they have, we could say, probably the best intentions. They have in their mind an idea and they want to see it through and they think this will bring about a benefit. But the fact is that our current social conditions are the result of past people who had past ideas that have they implemented and now we have to live with. And so if we do the same thing, if we today create new institutions based on old thinking, then future people will have to live with our thinking.
Mhm.
And so it's very important that we think in a new way, in a practical way, because we're sort of building the vehicle of society for the future people.
Mhm.
They will have to live with the institutions that we create today.
I think that's pretty clear.
All right, let's move on then to the next paragraph, the endeavor. So in this paragraph, he's going to talk about how at the present time, that would be 1919, various leaders have been working on the transfer of certain economic sectors, like the post office, the railroads, utility companies, coal and potash mines, and so on, transferring these over to the state ownership and control. And this is called nationalization or socialization. But Steiner advocates for the opposite, that such economic entities be entirely disentangled from the political state. The means of production should not be socialized, should not be owned and managed by the public, by the government. In a healthy society, the economic life will have its independence, while the political state will have the ability through the legal system to influence and regulate the economic life in a way consistent with rights consciousness. All right? Could you read
Hmm.
that?
Sure. The endeavor with which leading circles of humanity have begun, and which led to the transfer of certain economic sectors, post office, railways, etc., to state life, must give way to the opposite, to the disentangling of all economic activity from the realm of the political state. From these hitherto leading circles, thinkers who, with their will, believe themselves to be going in the direction of a healthy social organism draw the extreme conclusion to nationalize. They want the socialization of all means of economic life insofar as there are means of production. A healthy evolution will give the economic life its independence and the political state the ability, through the legal system, to influence the economic body in such a way that the individual person does not feel their integration into the social organism to be in contradiction with their rights consciousness.
Okay.
Yep.
So, in the previous paragraph, he was speaking about old habits of thinking. And
Mhm.
I've mentioned this before, but I think it belongs to our old habits of thinking to associate the private sector with the economic life and the public sector with the government.
Mhm.
And I think
Mhm.
in this paragraph, Steiner's suggesting that this is a false pairing and that it's possible under certain circumstances that public sector enterprises could be operated entirely independent of the government. So we could imagine, for instance, a nationwide railroad run by a public sector corporation under the new ownership framework that Steiner will describe in the next chapter of this book. And in this ownership framework, there would be a strict separation of ownership from management. So the national government, so the public, would remain the legal owner of the railroad, but the management would be appointed by an independent body of the cultural life based on competence and willingness to serve the social whole. And then agreements between the right state and the free and independent management would ensure that the railroad, say, was managed in a way that is consistent with serving the community or the society. This would not be private ownership, nor would it be socialism, but instead something new, which might perhaps be called private social ownership. Do you understand what I'm suggesting?
Um, so I'm sort of grasping it a little bit, I think. So it is not the government that is going to own. It is the public as a group that own it. So they have a stake in it, kind of like stock in it. Is that kind of
Well,
sort of how it is?
I don't mean that. I mean the
Hmm.
title ownership. The
Okay.
official legal owner of, say, the railroad or the highways or bridges or whatever infrastructure This
Hmm.
could be owned literally by the government. They have the
Okay.
title in their filing cabinet, but
Okay.
they are not the people who operate it. Okay, so the
Okay.
people who operate it would be chosen not by the government. It wouldn't be politicians deciding who runs it, or nor would it be the economic people deciding who runs it, but actually the cultural life decides on the basis of competence and willingness to serve. They will choose someone to run it
Hmm.
independently of state and economy.
Hmm.
And then that person or group or company or whatever, they would be operating and maintaining the railroads or highways or bridges or whatever we're talking about
Hmm.
independently. They would be owned by the public, by the government, but
Hmm.
the government would have no say in how they're managed.
Hmm.
But the ownership allows them, I call it the brake pedal, right? They can, if there's something that is not working, if they're not doing a good job of maintaining or whatever, keeping it up or whatever they're not doing well, the public can step in and say, we're going to get rid of this manager and we'll get another one.
Hmm. Hmm.
They cannot choose who that other one will be, but they can say they can call upon the free cultural life to choose someone else.
Hmm. Hmm.
And by separating the three areas of society, you can create a dynamic where you don't have this kind of nepotism,
Hmm. Hmm.
where the politicians are choosing their buddies to
Hmm.
run things and there's a lot of kickbacks and things like that happening.
Okay. All right. So a manager is chosen by the public. Is it
No,
someone?
no,
No.
no, no.
No, I'm
So
sorry. Is
it's the
chosen
whole
by
point.
the cultural life.
Yeah.
Cultural life. Okay. And cultural life meaning, is there are there associations?
No. The cultural life is literally the education system, the people that train and educate people. So let's say if you want to build a bridge, you need to have in the cultural life education for engineers and so on.
Hmm. Hmm.
And there are people that have skills and they're trained in these kinds of jobs that are related to bridge building, bridge maintenance, highway construction, highway maintenance. There's
Hmm.
a certain skill level there.
Hmm.
And this is not a political thing. This is a
Hmm.
matter of competence.
Hmm.
And so you have the cultural life who knows about competence choose someone who's competent rather than the political life choosing a politician to run this.
So in practical terms, somebody who's an engineer, as you were saying, the professors might have a say. Hey, I have this really cool student that I think could do the job. I nominate them, for instance. That might be a way to build a
It,
bridge, for
it,
instance.
it could be a student. In this case, it's probably better to choose someone who has a lot of experience as well. So,
Right.
so you would choose somebody who you just observe from the perspective of people who know the subject area.
Okay.
Politicians don't know the subject area. They don't know how to build a bridge. But you
Hmm.
ask the people who know how to build bridges, choose someone from amongst yourselves to maintain this bridge.
Hmm.
And
Okay.
it's not based on the economic life. You're not purchasing the appointment, or it's not a part of the life of goods. It's a part of
Hmm.
the life of abilities.
Hmm. Okay. So in this case, somebody would be like, you've got a whole group of engineers who have experience in the whole field, and they say, hey, so and so over there is competent, but he's also a really good organizer. He's also a good leader. I vote for him, that kind of thing.
Yeah. They would
Okay.
they would tap that person and say, "Would you be willing to take on this responsibility?" Right? And
Hmm. Hmm.
maybe or maybe not. And so it's a matter of them. They also have to agree to it. And
Sure,
then,
obviously.
but they arrange something. I'm just saying that the idea is to separate the management function from the ownership function. So
Hmm.
this engineer would not own the bridge, right?
Hmm.
The public would own the bridge.
Yeah.
You see?
Hmm.
Yeah.
Sorry, Mike, I just want to have an understanding. How is it now? how is it different? Like, so right now, let's say the infrastructure, let's say highways. Um, the public owns the highways. Yes? Is that how things are right now?
The way it works now is on
Mhm.
contract bids. Okay, so
Okay.
the
Hmm.
government would own the, let's say, the bridge, and they
Hmm.
would say, well, we need it fixed, so let's put out a contract bid, and they'll elicit from the private sector, from the economic life, a series of bids, and they'll usually choose the lowest reasonable bidder. It's like someone they'll pick someone who's going to do it the least expensively, but someone who has some ability to do this and not just some random person, right?
Hmm.
So the politicians will choose based on the bidding process. And so
Hmm.
it's more of a contractual decision. And
Hmm.
then the person is brought in to do this. And then once they've signed off on the contract, they might put up pylons and block off the bridge and then not work on it for years. And there's nothing you can do about that because they have the contract now.
Hmm.
And the process is more of an economic one, not based on competence.
Hmm. Hmm. Okay. So I just wanted to sort of highlight the differences. Like, how would it be different from now?
Yeah,
Because it wasn't very clear to me, like how, would this make a difference in, okay, I get sort of choosing somebody who would not be the owner, but would be the manager, I guess, and it would still be, it sounds like because it's not contractual, um, if the manager isn't doing a good job, I think I heard you say, then the government would say, hey, choose another person. The work isn't going ahead. And then it would go back to the cultural life to choose another competent manager.
right.
Do I have it right?
Yeah, the
Hmm.
right now it is based on a fairness principle. The
Hmm.
contractual bidding system there's certain rules about how to choose because if you don't have these rules in place, then in comes all the nepotism and corruption. So
Hmm.
so there's a rule-based process for choosing the contract, the bidder, right? On maintenance of the bridge, for example.
Hmm.
And this is not the appropriate mechanism because it's not a matter of fairness, it's a matter of competence. But because we don't have the separation between the government and the cultural life, the government sort of owns and runs and regulates universities and learning institutions. So there isn't a separation. And so even if you were to say, hey, call upon the universities to make a choice, let's say, they're beholden to the politicians, so they will choose what the politicians want, and the whole system will never escape corruption.
Hmm.
It's
Okay.
only once we have a separation of cultural life, government, and economy that we can even begin to think about this new framework.
Yeah, I think it's important to sort of point these things out, how it's done now, because again, I'm a layperson. I don't know these things. I kind of have an idea. Okay, yeah, government contracts. I don't know the things that you just said that were very important to understand that how what leads to corruption. And when you're saying that it's not an appropriate thing to sort of go on the process of fairness, but more of competence. Again, like key things here that I wouldn't have even thought of.
Yeah.
Like, okay.
And to repeat, this is the whole topic of chapter 3. So let's not pretend that we can understand all this in one go. It's
I'm
it's
not
very
pretending.
it's very multi-layered and complex. But
Mhm.
I think for now the takeaway is just can we imagine a system where public is not equal to government, private is not equal to the economy, but the notion of a private sector and a public sector maybe is a different one in a threefold society. That these words have a different, they're not equated with economy, private, government, public.
Mhm.
That the government has a different role than public sector, and the economy has a different role than private sector.
Mhm.
We separate, it's part of the new thinking to not just make these things equal.
Mhm.
Think outside this box.
Okay.
Okay?
Hopefully we'll get to sort of practice that.
Yeah. Yeah. All right. Now, the next paragraph, we switch to talking about labor again.
Mhm,
And I think this is probably the main part of the book where he speaks about the new labor framework.
mhm.
So let's just take a moment and go through this. I'll start with a preview, and then you can read it, please, and then we will discuss.
Okay.
So he's going to be saying, top of page 61, the ideas presented here are based on reality. Within the current capitalist economic system, the labor performed by workers has become integrated into the economy such that this labor is purchased by the employer like a good. An exchange is made between money, representing goods, and labor itself. But such an exchange cannot take place in reality. It only seems to take place. In reality, the employer compensates the worker for the value they add to the production process through their labor. In reality, goods only come into being through the collaboration of the worker, who contributes labor, and the employer, who contributes capital and raw materials. When these produced goods are subsequently exchanged for other values, namely the economic counter value, this counter value must be shared between employer and worker. Therefore, the production of goods must be understood as a collaborative joint venture by employer and worker, that is, the owners and managers and the workers. The product of this joint effort enters economic circulation. However, the relation between employer and worker remains a rights relation. Unfortunately, our current capitalist system distorts this relation by making use of the superior economic power held by the employer compared to the worker. This must not be allowed in a healthy social organism. And thus, labor itself must never be purchased like a good. This is because labor at no point possesses any kind of economic value that would be comparable to a good. A good can only be compared to another good. So, labor must be compensated as a matter of right, not as a matter of purchase or exchange. It is the rights life that must decide about regulations concerning labor, including how and how much a person must work for the social whole, based on their abilities and the conditions of a dignified, humane existence. And this can only happen if this regulation occurs through a rights state that is separate and independent of the economy. All right, so that's quite a mouthful. Let's
Absolutely. Yeah.
let's read the Steiner and then we'll discuss.
Okay. We can see clearly how the ideas put forward here are based on the real life of humanity if we direct our gaze to the work people perform for the social organism through their physical labor. Within the capitalist economic system, this labor has become integrated into the social organism such that the employer buys it from the employee like a good. An exchange is made between money, as a representative of goods, and labor, but such an exchange cannot take place in reality. It only seems to take place. In reality, the employer accepts goods from the worker that can only come into being if the worker gives over their labor to create them. From the equivalent counter value of these goods, the worker receives one share, the employer the other. The production of goods takes place through the collaboration of employer and employee. The product of this joint effort then enters the cycle of the economic life. To manufacture this product, a rights relation between worker and entrepreneur is necessary. However, through the capitalist type of economy, this relation can be transformed into one that is conditioned by the economic superiority of the employer over the worker. In the healthy social organism, it must come to light that labor cannot be paid because it cannot receive an economic value comparable to a good. Only a good produced through labor has an economic value comparable to other goods. The manner and amount a person has to work for the continued existence of the social organism must be regulated based on their ability and the conditions of a dignified humane existence. This can only happen if this regulation is carried out by the political state independently of the administration of the economic life.
Okay, so some of this we've already spoken about, and it refers to the two tracks that I mentioned in my summary at the beginning of the podcast.
Mhm.
I also want to point out he has a footnote here. This footnote 24 is actually Steiner's own footnote, not the translator. And so I'll just read that. This is on page 72. And Steiner adds a note to the new edition of 1920, and he says, it is entirely possible that in life, events are not only explained in a false sense, but that they take place in a false sense. Money and labor are not interchangeable values. Only money and the product of labor are. Therefore, if I give money for labor, I am doing something false. I create a sham process. Because in reality, I can only give money for the product of labor. So fundamental to Steiner's whole idea about his labor framework is to distinguish between labor, which is the activity of a human being that is always connected to that human being, and the detachable product or achievement of the labor, which can then go on away from the human being. So the classic example is the haircut, right? What the barber does or the hairdresser in terms of their labor is inseparable from them. But the haircut itself is belongs to it's detachable. It goes onto someone else's head and walks out the door, right? So the it's not a good that they're producing, but it's a service product that has the character of a good. And this haircut has the quality of a good that belongs to the economic life. And this is entirely separate from the labor that does not separate from the person who performs it. So we cannot exchange goods for labor because these are incompatible factors. We can only exchange goods for the product of labor. I can't buy the hair cutting person's work. I can only buy the haircut.
Mhm.
And as soon as I try to buy their labor, it's a kind of vestige of slavery. I'm trying to purchase the person.
Mhm.
And Steiner's very against this.
Mhm.
So this is the core idea,
Mhm.
right? Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. Yep, absolutely.
And maybe an example I could give, when I was one of my very first paid jobs when I was a teenager was I was hired to do lawn mowing at cemeteries. Okay. And so, this is an example, and then I was paid by the hour. So you can imagine a big cemetery, and the job was we didn't have lawn trimmers in those days, those nylon things that you could cut around, but it was really difficult to get in close around the headstones and the different objects that were on the ground. And so it was a pretty challenging job because there's a lot of fiddly work with the lawnmower. And, if I was being paid by the hour as a worker, um, I could kind of slow down, right? I could be like, how long does it take to do the cemetery? Well, it depends on how fast I work. And if my labor was paid by the hour, it's in my interest to work slower because then I can earn more money to do the same cemetery. And it's in the employer's interest that I work faster so that they don't pay as much. So the whole notion of paying by the hour creates this antagonism between the employer wants it done fast, the employee wants it done slow. You follow?
Yes.
But if you're, let's say, to the haircut example, you're paying a fixed fee for the haircut. And in that way, the labor is actually quite irrelevant. If the person spends an hour or 20 minutes, the time that they put in is not important. The skill is not important. What's important is the result. It's the culmination of the ability and the time and the labor that produces the product. And what I'm interested in paying for is the product, not the labor, not the person's abilities, but what the labor and abilities produce,
Hmm.
right? And so
Hmm.
only that economic product is part of the economic life. This is the idea.
Hmm. Hmm.
Now, that's not to say we can't pay people for hours. Like, let's say, we may have talked about this example before, hiring a cashier for an 8-hour shift, right? The 8-hour shift is a measure of the achievement. Just like, if I'm asking to get my hair cut, or my beard trimmed, I want the whole beard trimmed and not just the left half, right? So you have to have some kind of parameter for saying this is what the achievement encompasses.
Hmm.
And it's acceptable to say, well, in the case of a cashier, your achievement encompasses an 8-hour shift.
Hmm.
But that's not the same. That doesn't allow them to slow down and earn more by working more hours, you see?
Hmm.
It's a different thing. So it's not the hours that are important. It's how the relation is between the employer and the employee, or
Hmm.
the worker, could be a contractor. Are you paying for labor or are you paying for the product of labor?
Hmm.
Right? Does that make sense?
Right. Yes, it does. Yeah. So, I mean, he's trying to, it's a noble thing. He's basically trying to separate um, the human from basically being bought as slave.
Yep.
So distinguishing, I think this is part of the, sounds like it's part of the thinking differently as
Yep.
well.
Exactly.
Hmm.
And it's fundamental that we separate. It goes back to what he said. The first priority needs to be to separate the economy from the rights life, because
Hmm.
the product of the labor belongs to the economy, which is a completely separate area
Hmm.
than the labor itself, which is a matter of rights between people.
Hmm.
So for example, the rights between people, let's say there's a bunch of workers and they're picking fruit in an orchard or something, right? And
Hmm.
and one person decides, well, I'm just gonna sit down and look at social media on my phone all day, and the other people are out there climbing ladders in the sun and they're working and stuff. The labor part, like how much is everyone contributing? Like that is a human to human issue.
Hmm.
Is it really fair that that person is not contributing? That's a question of fairness, right?
Hmm.
And when that person at the end of the day wants to say, well, I was there too. I was on in the orchard all day long, just like you, so I should get paid. I should get a portion of the counter value for what comes back when the apples are sold or whatever fruit. Then it's a matter of what is fair. The
Hmm.
rights life says the labor, how much labor everyone contributes, is a matter of fairness.
Hmm.
But the product of that labor is a matter of economics. Do you see the
Hmm.
difference?
I do. I see the difference. That the fairness issue. Yeah, for sure. I mean, like this has happened many a time, I'm sure. Like my daughter has told me many times where, she would be grouped together with someone else and they would be doing a project, but she would have been the one that was working hardest or only one that worked on the project, yet both of them get the marks.
Yeah.
that she toiled for, which didn't feel fair. So I completely hear that. And I also understand, capitalists might sort of say this, yeah, the socialist idea of, taking the hard-earned money of my work and then handing it over to somebody else. That's not fair. So again, your example, apple orchard, person who's on social media and not picking a single apple, asking for same pay as the people that have picked hundreds of apples, absolutely, it's unfair. The labor being, I guess, the product, sorry, labor being part of rights life, product being part of the economic life. So there's 100 apples that have been picked from that orchard, brings about, I don't know, $100. How should that be distributed, right? So,
Exactly. This is the point. And going back to the classic example of, working in a group where one person does a different amount of labor. So we're not
mhm,
talking about the product, we're talking about the labor. That is a question of what is fair. And so there needs to be, Steiner saying, that needs to come from the side of the rights life, which could be the life of law or public law. And it basically sets out, a mandate, an obligation to work, that working people they're obliged to work 8 hours a day or whatever amount that the government or the democratic process decides, the rights
mhm,
consciousness, right? So
mhm,
let's say people come together democratically and they say, we decide that 8 hours a day or 7 hours a day is fair.
mhm,
Then that means that everyone needs to work 7 hours. And if that person is sitting on the social media and not working, then that is basically against the public law.
mhm, mhm,
So in Steiner's imagination, it's not just the entitlements. The rights are not just about entitlements. The rights are also about obligations. And because one person's entitlement is another person's obligation and vice versa. They're not separable.
mhm,
So I can't be entitled to a share of apples unless I contribute.
mhm, mhm,
So I have an obligation to provide the same labor as everyone else.
mhm,
And if I don't, I'm sort of in breach of a social contract.
mhm,
And
mhm,
so this is his picture that the rights life will establish the amount of work, the amount of labor, the type of labor, the conditions, the manner of labor. That's set out by the democratic right state, not the employer. They don't decide that. The government essentially, the democratic process decides that.
mhm,
And then once that's set out, then every person, not no exceptions, are obligated to provide that labor.
mhm,
And then on the economic side, you have the other track called the distribution contract, which sets out, let's say there's three people, they each get 1/3 of the counter value, whatever apples they pick
mhm,
together. If they all work and they all, sell the apples they produce, each person gets 1/3 of that.
mhm,
That's a distribution contract. And that's an
mhm,
economic question because
mhm.
they're all producing something and then they have a contractual right to the counter value.
Okay. So what happens when, say, a business owner who spends way more than 8 hours a day, maybe sometimes 16 hours a day, working to, eh, you know, help the business grow or even survive? What happens then?
Yeah, that's again all part of the distribution contract.
Hmm.
If someone is contributing more than the rights life, the minimum that the rights life stipulates, then they have an entitlement to have a higher counter value in their distribution contract.
Hmm. Hmm.
So in my understanding, there should be a match between contribution and profit share. So we had, I said, three people working in the orchard, but then there's going to be a lot more to it than that, right? There's someone that needs to organize them. They need to, arrange for the baskets and all the materials they need, get a truck. They need to then take it to the market and talk to the grocer and negotiate. And so all the workers, it's more than just producing the putting the apples from the tree into a basket.
Mhm.
There's more to it. And so there might be an individual or two that do more labor than the others, and then they should get a larger profit share as part of the distribution contract.
Okay, so help me understand this because somebody who has, I'm going to use a different example. Somebody who has gone to school for 10 years, who has learned to be a doctor, and so they've sacrificed quite a bit of their time and they've put in a lot of effort to develop these skills. And there's a person who, not to diminish any labor, this is not my intention, but I don't need to go to school to be able to dig a hole, right? So that person who is digging the hole, that doctor who has dedicated their entire sort of life just not doing anything other than studying in order to be the best doctor that they can be. Now, is there going to be a fair distribution? The only reason I'm asking this is because having gone to Cuba and heard, the complaints of people who live in Cuba, a person who has studied to be an engineer and a doctor was serving us at the hotels because they get more money from the tips, which is a very sad state of affairs. So is Steiner at all sort of talking to the fair compensation in that way, like where people have really developed a skill to spend decades developing a skill? Is that something that you know is that would that be in the rights category, or how would that come about?
Yeah, that's a very good, excellent question. You're talking about now the cultural life, the life of abilities, and how does the ability, so there are really these three components, right? There's the ability of the person, there's the labor, like someone with a great ability could be quite lazy, right? And or someone with great ability could work extremely hard with a lot of effort, or and vice versa. Someone with little ability could put in a lot of effort, right? So they're kind of independent variables that translate into the performance, into the achievement of the labor and abilities. That will translate into a product. Now, it doesn't matter if we're talking about apples or we're talking about medical services or serving at tables at a restaurant. These are all achievements of a combination of labor and ability. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So Steiner doesn't speak about the abilities in this particular paragraph, but I think it's clear that behind the scenes, the ability influences the outcome, the performance of the labor. So we can really think of this as a combination. Again, the ability adheres to the human being. You can't take the ability and just give it to somebody else. So, like labor, it is part of the human being. And so we cannot exchange abilities or labor for goods. But as you pointed out, if someone has great ability and great effort and great labor, they can produce much more than someone else. And so this needs to be part of the distribution contract for that individual, that they receive a corresponding uh, profit share that corresponds to their contribution.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Did I
Okay.
cover your question or
Yep. Yep. I mean,
also, yeah,
yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to say one more thing in my notes. Um, you said that the doctors sacrificed their time, and
Mm-hmm.
that's certainly true. But at the same time, when they were studying, let's say at medical school, they were not working. They were not at the same time providing services and goods to others. And in fact, they were only allowed to live because others were providing goods and services to them. So someone else was making the food that they ate while they were in medical school. Someone else was cutting their hair while they were in medical school. So there's the whole economy was supporting as it were, in a kind of process. We could say
Mhm.
gift, or it could be a loan that allowed that individual to develop those abilities. And
Mhm.
then that person later kind of has an obligation to pay back to the whole society from their developed abilities, because
Mhm.
otherwise it would just be an egoistic drawing from the society and not giving back,
Mhm. Mhm.
right?
I would hope that that's the goal. Yeah.
But that can
Yeah.
be the picture sometimes, that people think, well,
Mhm.
I went to medical school and I sacrificed, so many years of my life,
Mhm.
and now I should be paid really a high amount because I deserve it. Well,
Mhm.
think of it the other way. While you spent those years, someone else was actually sacrificing for you,
Mhm.
in fact.
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
so it wasn't just you sacrificing here.
Mhm. Mhm.
That's a misconception.
I'm just saying it because I think I've heard it. Um, I've heard this argument quite a few times, so I think it's out there.
Yeah,
And
that person had to have leisure time,
mhm.
and that leisure was carved out by the rest of society.
Mhm.
And then if they go on to say, now I had all this leisure time to develop and to study and to learn and to become really good at my skill, and now I have the right to take more from society as a result. I mean, this is kind of weird.
Mm. Mm. And yet it happens.
Yeah. It's an attitude that people have today
Yeah.
that is a partial truth. I'm not saying it's completely untrue. I'm just saying
Mhm.
it's a half truth.
Mhm.
And it can
Mm.
lead to really different pay scales out of proportion. So
Mhm.
that so that the manual labor and the sort of skilled laborer are not receiving proportionally a value, so that one is receiving too much and the other too little.
Mhm.
And so we need to find a way that to organize and collaborate among the three areas: the cultural life of abilities, the rights life of fairness, the economic life of goods. These three areas need to collaborate to find out how can we can settle the extremes of the physical worker with the what Steiner calls the spiritual worker,
Mm.
so that they're not out of proportion. And so this is an organism. It's not a mechanism. It's something that it's like how we in our body, we're continually going out of balance, and our body needs to continually reestablish equilibrium. So when we take in food, for example, this causes a disturbance that initiates a digestive and metabolic process to kind of ease out this disturbance and find a sort of reharmonize our body. In the same way, we have things going on in the physical labor and we have things going on in spiritual labor, and they're constantly causing these disharmonies, and that we need organs in an organism, social organism, to rebalance and find these connections again.
Mhm.
So we cannot imagine this as a mechanism. This is an organism, a social organism.
Got it.
So maybe on
Thank
that
you.
note, we will wrap it up for this podcast.
Sounds good to me. All
Okay.
right. We'll see you guys next time.
All right.
Bye.
All right. Thank you. Take care. See you next time. If you enjoyed this podcast, please hit like and subscribe.